Today we'll be building some modular pillars to use with our tabletop games. How are you today? Art Jeremiah here, and I'm back with another terrain building video. Subscribe to my channel for regular inspiration, and now let's get into that build. The very first thing I do is set my Proxxon hot wire cutter to cut just under an inch. This will be the basic width of the narrow part of my pillars. I then slice some 1-inch thick XPS foam into strips of this width. After I have a handful of these strips, I turn a handful of them horizontally and cut out multiple squares all at the same time. I feel that doing it this way is both time saving and keeps them more square, so I definitely recommend. I then set my Proxxon cutter to exactly 1 inch, and this will be for the top and the bottom sections of the pillars, so having them set at 1 inch will make it so they lock right into place of a 1-inch grid. If you're using a slightly bigger grid, I know a lot of people are using like 30mm or 32mm, I would just make them the same width as the grid that you're doing. This time the strips are going to be 1/2-inch foam, and they're cut in the same way as the 1-inch foam that we just got done cutting. And like I said, I do a handful at a time, both to save time and to make them more squared off. And I don't know the logic behind this, maybe it's just for me, but I really do feel like they get squared off a lot easier when I do it this way. And the goal with these is to make twice as many of the 1/2-inch pieces as we did the 1-inch pieces, because we're going to need 2 for each pillar. I'm usually not too accurate about how many I'm doing at a time. I just make a whole bunch because I know I'm going to be making more in the future. And then I just take each 1/2-inch piece and make a divot on each of the faces of the narrow part of the foam. As you can see, it lines up really well, and you can really get a groove going and get a lot of these pieces done really fast. I mean, you can literally get like 40 or 50 of these done in about 5 minutes, so this is a really effective way to add a simple design to your pillars. And now we're going to start the brickwork. And usually people use a hobby knife to make brickwork, but it looks way clean when you do the basic lines on a hot wire table. And in order to do this, I set my Proxxon cutter down to about 2 on the heat setting, and I do it in the similar way that we just did the decoration on the 1/2-inch pieces, but this time where the heat setting is low, we're just going to make thin lines. And so we don't have to move the Proxxon cutter setting too much. We just start out by cutting a center line onto all the inch-thick pieces of foam. After we get that cut through all of our pieces, I set the Proxxon cutter halfway between our center line and the edge of the inch-thick piece of foam. And using the same number 2 heat setting, we can go ahead and cut the lines of where the rest of the bricks will be. And as you can see, I can do it on one side and then just flip it over and do the other side. And again, this is a relatively quick process. It only took me about 10 minutes to carve out all these pieces with this hot wire cutter. And now we're actually going to pull out our hobby knife and start to cut out the brick shapes. And as you can probably see, I'm doing that staggered pattern that's so common with brickwork. And after I get all the line work carved out, I pull out my knitting needle and run it through all the cuts that we just made in the foam. A lot of people use pens for this, and those work just as well. And also, some pens you can even just use and not worry about making cuts like this. If you're looking for a pen like that, then I would totally recommend using a wider tipped black ballpoint pen. And if you want that sort of option, I will put an Amazon link to a pack of pens like this down in the description below. And also some other links of stuff that I used in this build. Since these are smaller pieces, I'm going to add texture to them using the shake method. I'm pretty sure most people have seen this, but if you haven't seen it, just put some rocks inside of a container with the foam pieces you want to texture and shake it up a whole bunch. And it'll give you a nice subtle rocky texture, as you can see right here. Now the pillars end up really lightweight, so I often like to add some weight to them. With this particular set, I'm using my Walnut Hollow Versatool, which has an interchangeable tip. And the tip I'm using here is wide and round, and it's the perfect width to fit pennies inside. And it doesn't really take much effort, just press this heat tool into one side of the 1/2-inch foam. And as you can see, the round hole that it makes is the perfect size for these pennies. You could also use washers too, but I think they're actually a little bit more expensive than pennies. and then it's as easy as hot gluing the penny into place. And you don't really have to use hot glue here. You can use whatever your go-to method is. Sometimes I also use all-surface liquid nails, and it's kind of arguable that it works better than the hot glue because the hot glue doesn't always stick to the metal as good, especially if the metal's kind of oily. I would definitely recommend washing the pennies with a toothbrush before doing this because it will stick to the hot glue a little bit better. But if you're going for speed, definitely use hot glue, and at this moment I was definitely going for speed. And as you can see, it's a really quick method just to add a little bit of weight. Now, we're adding the middle section to the bottom part of the pillar. And as you can see, when I hot glue the bottom part to the middle part, I actually beat the glue on the outside of the penny so that two pieces of the foam are gluing together rather than the penny gluing to the foam. And this is just because of what I was talking about earlier, how the penny doesn't always stick to the hot glue. This is one of the longer parts of the build, but it still only takes about 10 minutes for me to glue together about 24, I believe, of these pillars. So it's not very time consuming for something that looks so good. And as you can see, these pillars are looking pretty good so far. Okay, now I decided to get a little bit creative this time when I was doing the black undercoat. I've said this in my videos before, but part of this hobby for me is experimenting and coming up with new ways to do things, or ways that I haven't done things before. So with this, I'm just going to mix up some plaster. I'm going to mix it kind of thin, and then I'm going to add my PVA glue to the mixture. I already know that PVA glue mixed with plaster is really effective, but I still wanted to see how it would do as an undercoat on these pillars. So I mixed the plaster, the PVA glue, the water, and of course the black paint. And I just stir it all up until it's the consistency I want and the darkness that I want. This recipe is actually really similar to gesso, so I figured it would work pretty good. And I do believe that traditionally gesso is a mixture of rabbit skin glue and powdered marble. And it's just meant to be an undercoating for painting with any sort of acrylic or oil paint. So I figured this recipe of what I'm making would be pretty effective and similar to that. And I just added it to all my pillars in a really thick coat, and it did just paint on like any other undercoat. It was a little bit thicker, as you can see. I don't really know how to explain the thickness. I guess just imagine some thick cream with a little bit of grit in it, which sounds kind of a bit gross, but you know what I mean. The only issue I had with this recipe was that it dried somewhat translucent. Maybe I should add a little bit more black paint to the mixture, but regardless, it made a really hard surface that accepted the paint really well. And I would definitely use this recipe again and definitely recommend it. The only differences I would have made would be add a little bit more black paint to the mixture and maybe even add a little bit more plaster to the mixture. Regardless, I was really happy with how it turned out. And now we paint the pillars gray using a sponging technique. You may be able to notice that I'm not just using one color of gray or one shade of gray. I'm using two shades of gray, kind of a lighter gray and a medium to dark gray. And that's just to give it a little bit more variety. I just like the way it looks more realistic. And also the sponging it on like this makes it look more rocky and realistic as well. And since that sponging technique really adds a lot of depth to the pillars already, all I really need to do now is add a light highlight by dry brushing on Apple Barrel's Antique White. And you can add washes or different colors of bricks to your pillars, or make your pillars taller by stacking 2 of the inch sections on each other, or whatever you want. This is just your run-of-the-mill gray stone pillar. Now you can either make your own, or if you're not that crafty or don't have the time, you can consider purchasing from me on my Etsy store. I have these available most of the time. I will make sure to post a link to my Etsy store in the description down below. Now make sure to stay tuned until the end of the video so that you can see glamour shots of these pillars. If you happen to be getting some value out of this channel, consider joining us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and you will gain access to extra footage of videos like this one and videos that I've done in the past. The highlighted comment from last video is from Terrain Stop, and he says, "I'm just loving that rug. The blue underneath just makes the table pop, man. Everything just fits together nicely." Thanks a lot, Terrain Stop. I really appreciate those kind words. Also, I'm enjoying the builds over on your channel. You're an excellent craftsman. And now for more glamour shots, and stay tuned until the end of the video for some suggested content. And now you can continue the journey by clicking one of the 2 videos on the screen right now.